The storm had ripped through Red Hollow like a beast loosed from its chains. Roofs tore free and spun across the sky, wagons tumbled into ditches, and the dirt streets churned into rivers of mud. Amid the chaos, a scream split the air. Maria Windrow's youngest brother had slipped, his small body vanishing into the yawning mouth of the old mine shaft. His cries rose from the darkness, shrill and desperate, while the rusted chain he clung to strained and groaned under the pull of the storm water. "Help him!" Maria's voice cracked as she clawed at the ground. But the townsfolk only stared, frozen in the rain, some backing away as if death itself lived in that pit. And then, from the edge of the crowd, a tall figure stepped forward, a silent cowboy, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, a coil of rope in his hand. His jaw was set hard against the wind, his eyes fixed on the pit where a boy's life hung by a thread. Isaac Clayton was a man most folks noticed only when the work was too hard for anyone else. He didn't linger in saloons except to drink just enough to sleep, didn't sit on porches to swap stories, didn't throw dice or chase the skirts of laughing women. He lived in the gray margins of Red Hollow, in a shack built from the bones of an abandoned line shack on the edge of the dry ridge, and he spoke little more than was necessary to keep himself alive. At 30 years old, he carried the weight of a man far older. His shoulders sloped as though some invisible yoke pressed them down. His eyes, a hard gray, had learned long ago that hope could be a crueler master than despair. People said he'd once had a ranch outside the valley, a stretch of grazing land that might have grown into something. They said his cattle had been lean but promising, and that he'd worked dawn till dusk with a grit that should have made him a name among the settlers. But the prairie had other ideas. The drought had eaten his grass down to dust, and when the rains finally came, they drowned his fields and carried his herd into the swollen river. He buried beasts by the dozens, dragging them one by one into the earth until his back broke and his will with it. And when his father died that same winter, the last ember of his family's name went cold. His mother had passed years before. His brothers had scattered into towns farther west. Isaac was left standing alone in the wind, staring at a house that no longer felt like home, wondering if he had been cursed from birth or simply forgotten by God. He sold the land for a pittance and drifted into Red Hollow, a man stripped of both pride and purpose. The town took him in the way it took in a stray dog, tolerated, not welcomed. He hammered nails for the blacksmith, fixed fences for the ranchers too old to lift posts, broke horses no one else dared to touch. His hands, scarred and calloused, knew every form of labor but had forgotten the shape of gentleness. When nights grew heavy, he sat outside his shack with a bottle of rye and let the silence devour him. The truth was, Isaac had long since stopped believing he belonged anywhere or to anyone. Women passed him by as though he were carved from the same stone he carried on his shoulders. He never tried to stop them. Somewhere deep inside, he carried scars that weren't visible, the ache of being left, of being forgotten, of learning too young that love could be taken faster than it was given. He told himself he was done chasing it, that his life would be nothing more than work, whiskey, and the slow erosion of days into nights. But fate has a habit of creeping in when a man has convinced himself he no longer wants it. For all his silence, for all the shadows he lived in, there was still something unspent in Isaac, something he hadn't yet surrendered to the grave. And though he could not have guessed it that storm-soaked night in Red Hollow, when a boy's scream cut through the rain and a woman's desperate cry rose above the wind, that something was about to awaken. Maria Windrow had grown used to silence. Not the gentle hush that follows a hymn or the peace of evening crickets, but the heavier kind that pressed against her ribs whenever she walked through Red Hollow. People saw her, but they did not see her. They spoke of her, but rarely to her. Children repeated her name with cruel delight, whispering that she was cursed, half wild, a girl from nowhere who belonged to no one. She carried her head high, but inside, every glance and whisper cut like a knife. Her story began long before the storm. Her father had come out of Arkansas with dreams of land and cattle. Her mother was Apache, fierce-eyed, proud, with laughter that filled the canyons. From their love came Maria and her two brothers. That love should have been enough to shield them, But the frontier devours what is tender. A fever took her father, and not 2 winters later, soldiers rode through their homestead. The fire they left behind burned away her mother's songs, leaving Maria standing in the ashes with 2 small boys clinging to her skirts. At 18, she became everything: mother, father, protector. She patched roofs, split wood, bartered what little she could sew, and walked miles for water when the well went dry. There was no one to turn to but herself. And though she stood tall, the town never let her forget she was different. Too white for her mother's people, too Apache for the settlers. She lived between worlds, belonging to neither. The women of Red Hollow whispered she carried savagery in her blood. They drew their children close when she passed. The men were worse. Some laughed openly, mocking her patched dresses or the dirt beneath her nails. Others lingered too long with their eyes, making her skin crawl. Once, in the mercantile, Thomas Gray had sneered in front of everyone. "No man'll ever have her. She's as barren as the desert." The crowd had chuckled, and Maria, cheeks burning, had walked out with her head high though her heart crumbled inside. Her only refuge was her brothers. Jacob, restless and bold, already 12 and itching to prove himself. Little Samuel, only 8, gentle as spring rain, clinging always to Maria's side. For them she endured. She braided their hair, told them stories of their mother's people, mended their shirts by candlelight, and prayed the world would be kinder to them than it had been to her. They gave her purpose, even when loneliness threatened to choke her. Yet the loneliness was real. Nights in the small cabin were long. Sometimes she whispered to the empty dark, "I'm not beautiful enough. No man could ever love me." She hated herself for the weakness of those words, but the thought gnawed at her like hunger. The mirror showed her a face too brown for some, too pale for others, framed by hair that never lay smooth. She worked until her hands were raw, and still people only saw the daughter of no one. Each cruel word she endured sank deeper until she believed them. Then came the storm. It tore across Red Hollow with a fury that made even the oldest settlers pray. Roofs split open, wagons toppled, and the streets filled with roaring water. Maria clutched Samuel's hand as they tried to reach the safety of the church. Jacob ran ahead, bold as ever, until the ground beneath him gave way. With a cry, he vanished into the yawning mouth of the old mine shaft. Maria screamed his name and rushed forward, heart hammering as she heard his terrified cries echo from below. The chain he clung to groaned and slipped, ready to snap. Maria dropped to her knees, reaching, sobbing, but the gap was too wide. She shouted for help, begged the townsfolk who stood watching in the rain. Not one moved. Some muttered that it was too dangerous. Others looked at her with the same old disdain, as if Jacob's life was not worth the risk because of who his sister was. Their silence was louder than the storm, a cruelty sharper than any blade. Maria's voice broke as she cried again for help. She felt her strength leaving her, the terror of losing Jacob crushing the air from her lungs. Samuel clung to her, weeping, and in that moment, when hope seemed lost, she saw movement at the edge of the crowd. A tall figure stepped forward, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, rope coiled in his scarred hands. Isaac Clayton, a man who had lived at the edges, silent and withdrawn. His eyes, gray as the storm, fixed on the pit. His jaw was set, not in hesitation but in grim resolve. The storm had not been the first trial Maria faced, and deep inside she knew it would not be the last. Still, its fury tore at her spirit because of the indifference it revealed. She had long suspected the town would never stand for her, never rise when she cried, but suspicion is different than proof. That night, standing at the edge of the pit with rain hammering her face, she saw the truth written on every pale, silent countenance. They would let her brother die rather than risk their own skin for a windrow boy. Memories flooded her in that awful instant. Jacob laughing at dawn as he tried to help split wood, swinging the axe too wide and nearly toppling himself. Samuel crawling into her arms after a nightmare, whispering that he wanted their mother back. She remembered her mother's voice singing lullabies in a tongue Maria only half understood, promising the children that the spirits watched over them. Were they watching now? Or had the spirits too abandoned her family? The wind shrieked across the hollow, driving water like nails into her skin. Her dress clung heavy with mud. She pulled at the edge of the pit until her nails cracked and bled. "Please!" she begged again, her voice hoarse. "Somebody, please!" Faces blurred in the curtain of rain. Some looked away. Others shook their heads. One man muttered, "That mine's cursed. Best leave it." Another spat, "A windrow boy ain't worth dying for." Each word sank like stones in Maria's chest. Jacob's voice rose again, thin with terror. "Maria!" His knuckles whitened on the chain. Slipped an inch. She screamed, and Samuel buried his face against her skirt, sobbing. It was then, through the haze of grief and fury, that she noticed him. Isaac Clayton had been there all along, standing at the edge of the gathered townsfolk like a shadow no one wished to claim. He moved without speaking, pushing through the men who muttered excuses. His hat brim dripped steady streams. His rope was already uncoiling, each loop deliberate, steady, certain. He did not ask permission, did not weigh the worth of the life below. He simply acted. His gray eyes locked on the pit, and for the first time that night, Maria felt something cut through the storm louder than thunder, hope. In that heartbeat, Maria understood two truths. First, that her brother's life was about to be pulled back from the mouth of death by the one man no one in town truly saw. Second, that for the first time since her parents died, she was not entirely alone. The realization burned in her chest like a fragile flame, one she dared not yet trust but could not ignore. The storm raged, the crowd shrank back, but a single figure stepped forward, and hope returned with him. Isaac Clayton had never thought of himself as a savior. The truth was simpler. He knew what it felt like to be left behind, and he would not let a boy learn that lesson in the dark of a mine shaft. The storm howled around him, rain stinging his face like shards of glass, but his hands moved with the certainty of long habit. He tied a knot in the rope, braced his boots against the mud-slick ground, and threw the free end to a man who caught it without thinking. "Hold it steady," Isaac said, his voice low but firm. It was the first sound he had made all night, and it cut through the storm like steel. No one moved to argue. Perhaps they were too stunned to see the silent ranch hand take command, or perhaps some part of them was relieved to let another risk the fall. Either way, Isaac wasted no breath on them. His eyes fixed on the boy below. The chain screeched, slipping another inch. Jacob's cries were raw, desperate. "Hang on," Isaac called, and then he was gone, vanishing over the lip of the shaft. The descent was brutal. The rope bit into his palms, reopening scars from years of labor. Rain poured down the shaft, turning stone slick as ice. His boots scraped for purchase, and more than once his shoulder slammed into jagged rock. Each jolt sent sparks of pain down his arms, but he did not slow. He knew the chain could break at any second. When at last he reached Jacob, the boy's face was white with terror, his fingers bleeding where metal had cut deep. "Don't let me fall," Jacob cried, his voice barely more than a whimper against the roar of the storm. "You won't," Isaac said, steady as bedrock. He wrapped the rope around the boy, knotting it fast against his small chest. The rain blinded him, the roar of wind deafened him, but his hands did not falter. He pulled the boy close, shielding him from the worst of the spray, and tugged the rope in signal. Above, the men hauled with a will they had lacked a moment before. The line went taut, and slowly Jacob began to rise. He clutched Isaac's neck, trembling, as the world lifted him towards safety. Isaac climbed with him, pushing off sharp stone, his own body scraping raw against the walls. The shaft seemed endless, every inch a battle. His muscles burned, his breath tore ragged from his lungs. Twice his boots slipped and his weight wrenched against the rope, jarring his shoulders with pain. But still he climbed, inch by inch, until hands reached from above and pulled Jacob over the rim into Maria's arms. Her cry of relief rose above the storm, fierce and broken, the sound of a heart that had nearly shattered. Isaac hauled himself over a moment later. His hands were shredded, palms torn and bleeding. His coat was ripped, his cheek cut from stone. He staggered to his feet, meeting Maria's gaze only for an instant. Her eyes, dark and wide, shone with something he could not name: gratitude, terror, wonder. He did not wait for words. He simply tipped his hat, turned, and walked back into the rain. The crowd parted for him, silent now. Some looked ashamed, others merely curious. But Isaac did not see them. He had no desire for their praise or their questions. He had done what was right, nothing more. By the time Maria gathered her breath to speak, he was gone, swallowed by the storm as though he had never been there at all. That night, when the storm finally broke and the stars returned, Maria sat by the window of her cabin. Her brothers slept, Jacob bandaged and safe, Samuel curled against him. The world was quiet again, but inside her chest a storm still raged. She whispered into the darkness, the words spilling like a wound she had never dared reveal. "I'm not beautiful enough. No man could love me." The wind carried her confession into the night. What she did not know was that Isaac, passing by on his way to his lonely shack, heard every word. He paused in the shadows, rain dripping from his hat brim, and for a moment his scarred hands trembled. He wanted to speak, to tell her that she was wrong, that she was stronger and more beautiful than she believed. But the words caught in his throat. He turned instead, disappearing into the night, carrying her pain with him like another scar upon his soul. The storm had passed, but its scars lingered. Red Hollow smelled of wet timber and charred smoke, the air heavy with the memory of roofs torn open and walls collapsed. Families patched what they could, mending fences, sweeping mud from cabins, hammering nails through broken beams. Life, in its stubborn way, moved forward. But for Maria Windrow, the storm's passing had left more than fallen shingles and waterlogged floors. It had left questions that burned like hidden embers. She remembered Isaac Clayton's hands, torn and bloodied from stone. She remembered the silence of the crowd as he vanished into the rain. Each night, she turned the memory over in her mind, searching for its meaning. He had risked his life without hesitation, and yet he had spoken no word to her afterward. She told herself it meant nothing, that he had done what any man would do. But deep down she knew it was a lie. Most men had done nothing. He alone had stepped forward. And still, she could not believe that anyone might have seen worth in her. The town gave her no comfort. If anything, the whispers grew louder after the storm. Some claimed she had bewitched Isaac into risking his life. Others sneered that it was pity, nothing more, that a broken man had nothing left to lose, and so he gambled with his neck for the sake of a half-breed widow of brothers. Maria endured it as she always had, chin high, eyes forward, but inside, every word was another stone on a burden she already carried alone. It was in those days that Thomas Gray returned. He had been gone for near a year, working trails in Texas, or so he boasted. When he rode back into Red Hollow, astride a bay mare with a new revolver strapped to his thigh, the town greeted him with nods and easy smiles. Thomas had grown harder in his absence. His jaw was sharper, his eyes colder, his laugh darker. But he carried with him the same cruelty Maria remembered all too well. They had been children together once, though even then he had mocked her. By 15 he had turned his jeers into public sport, using her name as a punchline in front of other boys. He had once tossed mud at her dress during Sunday service, drawing laughter that still echoed in her memory. Over the years he refined his cruelty, finding words sharper than stones. And though Maria's silence often robbed him of satisfaction, she could never forget the sting. Now he returned with more swagger, more malice. On his second day back, he strolled into the mercantile where Maria stood with her brothers, trading a basket of sewn shirts for flour. The store was crowded. Storm repairs had everyone clamoring for supplies. Thomas's voice cut through the murmur like a whip. "Well, well," he drawled, loud enough for all to hear. "If it isn't the half-breed queen of Red Hollow. Got yourself a new savior, Maria? Heard old Isaac Clayton dragged your brat out of the pit. Tell me, did you thank him proper? Or are you still too high and mighty for that? Laughter rippled through the room. Maria froze, her fingers tightening on the basket. Jacob's jaw clenched, but he was still too young to challenge a grown man. Samuel pressed close to her side, eyes wide with fear. Maria lifted her chin. I paid my thanks. Her voice was steady, though her heart pounded. Thomas smirked, circling closer. Paid your thanks? To a man like Clayton? He's a drunk, a failure. Lost his ranch, lost his family. Only thing he's good for is crawling into holes. Fitting, ain't it, that the only man willing to touch you is the one with nothing left to lose? The words hit like blows. The townsfolk did not speak against him. Some chuckled, others shifted uneasily, but none stepped forward. Maria stood alone in their circle, humiliation burning her cheeks. She wanted to scream, to strike, but her brother's small hands anchored her. To fight would only feed Thomas's cruelty. To walk away would leave his laughter ringing in her ears. Thomas leaned closer, his voice dropping but no less cruel. Face it, Maria, no man will ever love you. Not a settler, not an Apache, not even a beggar. You'll die here alone, dragging those boys down with you. Something inside her cracked at those words. They were the echo of her own darkest thoughts, the whispers she confessed only to the night. Spoken aloud, in front of everyone, they seemed to steal the breath from her lungs. Her throat tightened, her eyes burned. She wanted to vanish, to sink into the floor and never rise again. Jacob moved then, stepping between her and Thomas. You shut your mouth, the boy snapped, his voice shaking but fierce. The crowd gasped softly, and Thomas laughed, a cruel bark. He crouched to Jacob's level, his grin like a blade. Careful, pup. Bite too soon and you'll get put down. The storekeeper cleared his throat, uneasy. That's enough, Thomas. But Thomas straightened with a flourish, sweeping his hat in mock apology. Of course. Wouldn't want to break the poor girl's spirit. Looks like life's done that well enough. His words rang out, heavy and sharp, before he turned and strode away, leaving silence in his wake. Maria stood trembling, Jacob's small frame still braced before her, Samuel clinging to her skirt. She wanted to thank Jacob, to comfort him, but her throat was closed tight. Around them, the settlers avoided her gaze. Not one came forward to offer a kind word. Shame settled over her like the weight of the storm's mud, clinging, suffocating. That night, she wept alone. She waited until her brothers were asleep, their breathing steady, before burying her face in her hands. Thomas's words echoed mercilessly. She was nothing. She was unloved. Even Isaac Clayton's silent rescue felt fragile in her memory, as though it might vanish if she dared believe it meant more than duty. Outside, Red Hollow slept, but Maria sat awake until dawn, staring at the shadows on her wall. The threat had returned, not only in the form of Thomas Gray but in the poisonous certainty he carried, that the world would never allow her peace, never allow her dignity, never allow her to believe she could be more than what they named her. The storm had passed, but another was rising, and this one would not break roofs or flood streets. It would break her spirit, unless someone stood beside her. The morning sun cut sharp and golden across Red Hollow, but the air carried an unease thicker than storm clouds. News spread quickly that Thomas Gray was spoiling for another spectacle. He had chosen the square in front of the saloon, the place where men gathered to trade, spit, and judge. By noon, half the town had drifted there, drawn as much by the promise of cruelty as by curiosity. Maria tried to keep to herself that day. She had no wish to stand in the open, no wish to be made a target again. But she needed flour, and Jacob had insisted on carrying firewood to sell. So she found herself near the square, her brothers beside her, their faces wary but determined. She told herself she would walk quickly, keep her head down, and leave before Thomas could catch sight of her. Fate had other plans. He was waiting, his hat tilted back, boots planted wide, revolver gleaming in the sun. When his gaze locked on her, a grin spread across his face like oil on water. He raised his voice so all could hear. Well, look who's come crawling back into the light. Maria Windrow, the pride of Red Hollow. He bowed low, mocking. Tell me, darling, did you finally find the courage to thank your savior? Or are you still too busy dreaming you're worth saving? The crowd chuckled. Some shifted uneasily, but most leaned in, eager for entertainment. Maria froze. Every instinct screamed to flee, but her brothers stood rooted. Jacob stiff with anger, Samuel trembling. She could not abandon them to Thomas's jeers. She steadied her breath, lifted her chin, and stepped forward. You've said enough, she answered, her voice steady though her hands trembled at her sides. Leave us be. Thomas laughed, spreading his arms as though presenting her to the crowd. Leave you be? Why, Maria, you're the best amusement this town has. Half Apache, half settler, loved by neither, clinging to scraps while pretending you're equal to us. You're a joke. And deep down, you know it. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but no one stopped him. Maria felt their eyes like knives. She saw smirks, heard snickers, felt her dignity splinter under the weight of their silence. Thomas stepped closer, his voice lowering to a blade's edge. You'll never be loved, Maria. No man worth salt would ever claim you. Not now, not ever. The words pierced deeper than he knew. They echoed the confession she had once whispered to the wind. I'm not beautiful enough. No man could love me. Her throat closed. For a heartbeat, she nearly believed him. Then, a voice cut through the square like thunder. You're wrong. The crowd turned. Isaac Clayton stood at the edge of the gathering, his tall frame straight despite the scars of labor and loneliness etched into him. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, fixed on Thomas with a fire none had seen before. He stepped forward slowly, each boot striking the dirt with the weight of finality. She's stronger than all of us, Isaac said, his voice ringing clear. She's raised those boys alone, while cowards like you spit from the sidelines. She's endured storms you wouldn't survive a day in. And I've loved her all my life. The words struck the crowd silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Maria's heart hammered in her chest. She stared at Isaac, hardly believing what she'd heard. His eyes found hers, steady and unflinching, and for the first time she saw not pity, not duty, but truth blazing there. Thomas faltered, his sneer wavering. He tried to laugh, but the sound cracked. You? Love her? You're a drunk, a failure. You've got nothing. Isaac cut him off, his voice sharp as a whip. I've got more than you ever will, Gray. I've got the courage to stand beside her. Do you? The question hung in the air, heavier than lead. The crowd shifted, whispers rising. Men who had laughed before now avoided Thomas's eyes. Women drew their children closer. The balance had shifted, and Thomas knew it. His hand twitched toward his revolver, but Isaac's gaze locked on him, steady, unafraid. For a long moment, the square held its breath. Then Thomas spat in the dust, muttered something under his breath, and shoved his way out of the circle. His boots struck the ground hard, his swagger broken. Silence lingered. All eyes turned back to Maria. She stood trembling, her breath ragged, her brothers clutching her hands. Isaac remained where he was, hat in hand now, waiting, not pressing, not demanding. Maria's throat burned. Her whole life, she had been told she was unworthy, unlovable. And now, before the very people who had watched her suffer, a man had shattered that lie with words she had never dared dream of hearing. Slowly, almost against her will, she lifted her eyes to meet his. What she saw was not pity. It was not obligation. It was love, raw and unhidden, waiting only for her to believe it. The square erupted in murmurs, but Maria heard none of it. For the first time, the noise of Red Hollow faded into silence. There was only her brothers, and Isaac Clayton, standing like a pillar of truth in a world that had given her nothing but scorn. She did not speak, not yet. Her voice had been stolen too many times, and she needed to find it again on her own. But her eyes, glistening with tears she no longer hid, told him what words could not. And Isaac, seeing them, smiled faintly. A smile not of triumph, but of quiet relief. In that moment, something broke in Red Hollow. Not in Maria, not in Isaac, but in the cruel hold the town had long kept over them both. Thomas's words no longer ruled her. The silence of the settlers no longer defined her. A new truth had been spoken, and it could not be unsaid. For the first time, Maria felt the weight of shame lift. For the first time, she believed she was not alone. The resolution had come not in the form of fists or gunfire, but in the courage of words that cut deeper than bullets. I've loved her all my life. Dawn came softly to Red Hollow, pale light spreading across the hills like a gentle hand. The storm had long since passed, Thomas Gray had been silenced, and yet the town itself felt much the same. Fences still needed mending, roofs still leaked, and dust still gathered in corners no matter how often one swept. But for Maria Windrow, something had shifted, quiet as a seed breaking earth. The air seemed lighter, the weight upon her chest not quite so crushing. Her brothers rose early, as always. Jacob split kindling behind the cabin, his face solemn but steadier now, the memory of his defiance against Thomas carved deep into him. Samuel carried water with both hands, splashing half of it onto his shirt, laughing at his own clumsiness. Maria watched them with tenderness swelling in her chest. They were growing into young men faster than she could bear. They deserved more than scraps of survival. They deserved hope. She thought of Isaac then, of his voice in the square, ringing out against the silence of cowards. I've loved her all my life. The words still echoed within her, frightening in their honesty. Could they be true? Could anyone truly see her as worthy, after all the years she had been told otherwise? The doubt clung stubbornly, but beneath it, warmth stirred like the first glow of fire on a winter morning. The knock came just after sunrise, gentle, almost hesitant. Maria froze, her heart leaping to her throat. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door. Isaac Clayton stood there, hat in hand, eyes lowered in respect, a flour sack balanced against his hip. His shirt was patched at the elbows, his boots scuffed, his hands still raw from the storm. But to Maria, he looked nothing like the failure the town named him. He looked steady. He looked real. Her brothers saw him before she could speak. Samuel shouted with delight, racing forward to tug at his sleeve. You came back. Jacob's lips twitched toward a smile he tried to hide. Isaac crouched, setting the flour on the porch. Figured you could use this, he said simply. His voice was quiet, carrying no grandeur, no boast, and maybe some help fixing the fence. Maria stood in the doorway, hands clasped together to still their trembling. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to ask why he had come, but her throat closed. Instead she studied him, the way he kept his hat pressed against his chest, the way his gaze flickered toward her but never forced itself, the way he seemed content to stand there until she found her own words. Finally, she managed, You don't owe us anything. Isaac lifted his eyes then, and in them she saw the same steady truth he had spoken in the square. I know. A pause. But I want to. Her breath caught. No one had ever spoken such words to her. Not as pity, not as obligation, but as choice. It frightened her, and yet it filled her with a fragile joy that made her chest ache. Her brothers were already dragging him toward the fence, Samuel laughing, Jacob trying to hide his grin. Maria stepped back, watching the scene unfold as though it belonged to someone else's life. Isaac's hands moved with practiced ease, steadying posts, tightening rails. Samuel fetched nails, Jacob hammered, the three of them working together as though it had always been so. The sight pierced Maria's heart. It was what she had prayed for in silence through long nights, that her brothers might one day have a man's steady guidance, that laughter might return to their home. By midday, the fence stood straight again. Isaac wiped his brow with his sleeve, leaning against the post. Maria brought him water, their fingers brushing as he took the cup. The touch was brief, accidental, yet it lingered, sparking warmth that startled her. She met his gaze and neither looked away. Words trembled on her tongue, doubts, fears, the old refrain she had whispered for years. I'm not beautiful enough. No man could love me. But the words did not come. They no longer held her captive. She remembered Isaac's voice, strong and unwavering before the town. She remembered his actions, silent but certain, pulling her brother from the pit, standing against Thomas, arriving now with flour and a willing hand. His truth had already answered her fears. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in amber and rose, Maria found herself smiling. A small, trembling smile, but real. It had been so long since her lips remembered the shape of it. Isaac saw and returned it, not with triumph but with quiet wonder, as though her smile was the greatest gift he had ever received. The world outside remained harsh. The frontier still bore its cruelties. Droughts, storms, hunger, prejudice that would not vanish overnight. But inside that small cabin, on that quiet day, something new had taken root. Maria stood at the doorway as Isaac prepared to leave, flour sack lighter, hat once more in his hand. The boys begged him to stay, and for a moment, Maria nearly spoke the same. But she held her tongue, knowing some things must come slowly, built not on desperate pleas but on steady steps. Isaac seemed to understand. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said simply. "If you'll have me." Her answer was not in words but in the way her eyes softened, the way her smile returned unbidden. Isaac touched the brim of his hat, turned, and walked into the twilight. Maria watched until he vanished into the dust. Then she stepped back inside, her brothers chattering about fences and hammers and how strong Isaac was. She let their voices wash over her, warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in years, the future did not feel like an enemy. The frontier had not changed. The town had not repented. But something far greater had shifted. For Maria Windrow, who had long believed herself unlovable, and for Isaac Clayton, who had long lived in silence, everything had changed. And in that quiet ending, lit by the glow of a new dawn, love finally took root where no one believed it could.